Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Today we have another story from our friend Phee Stringer called Post Op. We've read a few other stories of his on the channel, and you can check him out on Amazon at the link down below. And for today's ambience, I have created a creepy hospital soundtrack for you in the background. And now, on with our story time. The anesthetic gas brought back memories from one of the hernia surgeries he had had when he was 7 years old. The sweet-smelling gas had a sting of fear woven into the fluorescent lights images above, fading in and out of Gary's past. He remembered the strange way he drifted into consciousness during the surgery and seeing the Asian doctor's head hovering above him. The doctor's body was behind a blue surgical screen as he looked down at the young Gary. Gary's youthful and sedated mind processed the image of the doctor not as obscured by a screen, but as disembodied and floating above him in a ghostly, intrusive way. Now, the 37-year-old Gary had found himself under the knife again. The reason for his surgery was to correct some problems with his abdomen. Gary could not recall in his present state exactly what the reason for this operation was. He heard the sounds first as he started to achingly come out from his darkness and fog. His eyes would not open, or he had not restored a desire to open them. Shuffling slippers, faint machinery, and mumbles of patients, doctors, and televisions. The pressure and chills on his body made any thoughts of movement as far away as the most distant stars. Gary Heckner, one of the voices said. He remembered that was his name. The voice was close by when it said his name. The swirling medical fog was starting to move like a tide in the evening, coming in, bringing darkness. He did not fight the blanket of drugs that was taking effect. The sounds began to fade into nothingness. When the tide receded this time, Gary first felt his body. His toes and his fingertips felt like they had been bathed in ice. He also felt his wound, a concentrated spot of sickness on the top of his stomach and chest, with random spikes of a stinging pain that almost felt unfair given his helpless state. He felt a vibration in his throat, and it took him a few seconds to realize it was himself, moaning. The sound he was making had attracted some attention from the staff of the medical facility. The person that came to see him was asking questions. Gary was unaware of what the questions were, what he was saying in answer, or if he was even answering the questions being asked. His arm was raised, and he took the paper cup full of water and put it to his lips. His eyes opened for the first time, and part of him expected the blinding fluorescent lights to flood into him as was expected post-surgery. Instead, the light was a subdued olive quality with a tinge of gray and yellow. He managed to say, "Thank you." The medical person's response must have been distorted through his medication, or in another language, as it sounded guttural and unrecognizable. Gary did not care as what could be considered sleep took him once again. More lateral, the next voice said. It was a dry, analytical voice. How about here? The other voice was cold and official sounding as well. but slightly younger. Gary's eyes opened as the pain flew through his nervous system, emanating from his abdomen. Gary started to scream. It was too weak to make the appropriate sound. It came out as a rasp and gurgling sound. The pain was intense enough so that he quickly squeezed his eyes shut. That wasn't it, the older voice said. The pain subsided. I'll try here, the younger voice said. Pain again, so intense that Gary this time let out a laugh of disbelief. The laugh was more of a high-pitched bark. More lateral, the older voice said, sounding annoyed. There were tears in Gary's eyes due to the extreme pain that pulsed through his body like lightning. Despite these distortions, Gary could tell that something was wrong with what his eyes were taking in. The ceiling was covered with moss or mold. The lights were not consistent. They were sick green and yellow, and flickering and shifting. More lateral, one of the voices said again, followed by what had become the customary jolt of unreasonable pain. Gary let out a series of swear words and other sounds that were ignored. More lateral, the voice said again. His fists were hurting the next time he woke up. He looked down at each of his hands and saw they were bruised and red. He tried to look more closely, but his hands were strapped to the sides of his bed. He was still too weak to do anything other than rattle the sides. I'm sorry about that, a woman said in a kind voice from somewhere near the foot of the bed. The last time you woke up, you were confused. I don't, Gary rasped, desperately needing water for his throat. The woman approached with a paper cup. Gary tipped his head up, getting a sip of water. I don't remember, he said. That's normal, she said, walking back to the foot of the bed. You had an issue. You were out of sorts, and you... She paused and gave a small laugh. You punched one of the nurses a couple times when you were thrashing around. You were not yourself. You were calling her a monster, the doctor was informed. She is okay. Nothing some vodka and an ice pack can't solve. She turned around and looked at him. Her face looked kind, then went blurry. It came into focus again, the features on the woman's face rearranging themselves, and there was a crackling sound. The eyes drifted and multiplied on her face, and now there were roughly 6 eyes, shiny and black. The mouth opened and the bottom jaw was sucked back into the woman's neck, which was elongating. Due to the drugs, pain, or the woman's shifting appearance, Gary shut his eyes and fell into unconsciousness. The noises that Gary heard were disturbing. He could not tell if it was an echo from a dream or some mysterious show on one of the televisions in the facility. Because of this, he decided to keep his eyes closed for the time being. It brought to mind the many times in his boyhood when he would try to pretend as if he could hear them and that he still slept. It possibly never worked, and at the moment, he could not remember anyway. Gary just knew that he felt like not seeing anything. The television or radio he was overhearing was flowing in and out of sense. A drama about cheating teenagers made sense. Then it would fold into bubbles and gurgling noises mixed with static. He heard something about the toxic winds from the caverns in the north. There was a series of footsteps that drowned out the sounds of the media. Shoes on linoleum, slippers sliding. Something was being wheeled and dragged. The focus on sounds gave way to physical sensations moving through the skin. and nerves. He could barely remember not only what, but where the surgery in his body had occurred. The places where the pain was centered wandered around his person like an autonomous battery-controlled children's toy. Was it in his stomach? Was it the back of his knee? Perhaps his back, around the lower part of his spine. His skin felt chills dancing around its surface, the unmistakable feeling of a fever exploring him. The thoughts fell into his head now like heavy stones in a murky pond. Where are the friends and people in my family? Shouldn't they be sitting here holding my hand while telling me when I get to come home? Another stone fell into the water of his mind. Who are my friends and family? Doctor, Gary called out into the cold ambience. He had opened his eyes, and confusion and fear swirled around his visions. He was relieved when he heard the footsteps approaching, but it was offset with the dread of who might arrive and what they might say. Yes, mister. I'm not a doctor. Gary, for some reason, could not understand the last name she had said with a bizarre accent. We were a bit concerned about the way your medications were affecting you, so we've altered them slightly. Affecting me, Gary rasped, taking his cup of chalky water. Is that why I've been... Have been what? The woman's voice asked. I don't know. Tears filled his eyes. Something is just so wrong, and I can't feel right. I am so sorry. I hope the adjustments will help. Doctor, we'll see you soon. As the owner of the feminine voice walked away, the sobs that Gary was breathing through pushed him uncomfortably into sleep. Gary's discomfort was waiting for him when he woke. This time, the dread was making him choose to keep his eyes shut as he began talking to himself in mumbles and whispers. Okay, Gary. He began trying to distance himself from the dread he felt by referring to himself in the third person. When you open your eyes, you might see things that don't make sense, and you just have to remain calm and ask for help. He was going through his memories, trying to find a point of context to anchor his mind to. He remembered a time when he was at the supermarket and a woman outside was in an argument with who was presumably her daughter. The woman had clearly been distressed and possibly ill. The phrase that came to Gary's mind that the woman had cried to her daughter was, "Every time I wake up in the morning, I am not me anymore." The thought that one could wake up not themselves opened a cascade of possibilities that settled on a singular thought. What if I take for granted that every time I wake up, the world will be the same? Gary, he said to himself, they messed up your meds. You are not thinking right. Still feeling out of it, the voice sounded like a cheap radio speaker. His eyes opened to a dark greenish color. It looked spotty and strange, as if the ceiling and curtains in his recovery area could not decide what substance they were supposed to be made of. What did you do to me? He tried to take his own advice and sound calm, but he sounded like a scared boy lost in the woods. Your surgery was a success. Static voice shifted and blurred into other sounds for a moment, and then came back into something that was understandable again, as successfully placed within. Your recovery is taking a bit longer than we. Gary turned his head quickly to find the source of the voice. There was nothing there, just the curtain-like objects around him. The TV sounds had also morphed into the sounds of liquids moving from one container or another. either by squeezing or pouring. He looked around, unable to gather much information about who had been speaking to him. Okay, Gert. He could not think of his own name, and he cried out, "You were just..." In a voice he barely recognized, he whispered, "I am just..." The man, who may have used to be called Gary, did not hang on to much of his rationality when he fully woke up. His bed sat high on a hill or plateau. Cold winds circulated around him, and his restraints were gone. He pulled the blanket up to his neck and shook with fear and cold. The air smelled of fresh citrus mixed with rotting flesh. The land itself was pulsing and bubbling and churning slightly, its greenish-gray hues blurred and undefined. The ground beneath the bed shifted, as if just underneath a large mass of insects was ready to break free. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you after the operation." The genderless voice came from everywhere, including inside the patient's head. It was powerful, and yet emotionless. The patient's eyes squinted at the writhing mass of tentacles, eyes, and other unnameable organic forms that were the sky. Directly above, there was a large, inhuman mouth that all of the features circled like the eye of an unbelievable storm. "I am, Doctor." The voice began again from the massive orifice. "Unfortunately, the medications you took after your operation had some side effects that were quite unexpected. We're working to get things back to normal as soon as possible. Normally, the side effects only will affect the patient's health and well-being. But as you may have noticed, they stretched beyond you and affected much more." "I" was the only sound the man in the bed could manage to say. "I need to ask a few questions so we can get you back on the right track." The massive tongue licked the lips that were miles above before it spoke again. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much discomfort would you say you are experiencing at this moment? And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams.